Something extraordinary happened in the church, a moment nobody expected, not scholars, not theologians, not even Catholics who follow church news casually. It did not come with scandal or media frenzy but quietly, like a crack appearing in an ancient wall long assumed unshakable. The international Mariological community, those devoted entirely to the mysteries of Mary, publicly challenged and rejected Cardinal Victor Manuel Tucho Fernandez's latest document, Mater Fidelis. They did so openly, formally, without the usual whispers of academic debate. And their response carried weight because what was at stake was not a minor title or single devotion but the Church's very understanding of the Mother of God and her role in the history of salvation. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. The International Marian Association's Theological Commission issued a 23-page response, full of detailed argumentation and historical evidence, not slogans or posturing. From the outset, it was clear they were not trying to embarrass the dicastery or stir drama but were defending the integrity and continuity of Marian doctrine as the Church has taught it for centuries. For decades, scholars who have taught and defended Mariology were faced with a document suggesting something fundamentally wrong. Mater Fidelis claimed that the title, Co-Redemptrix, had always been inappropriate, not merely in recent decades but always. The scholars responded with the undeniable fact that if this were true, countless popes, saints, and mystics who had used the title had acted imprudently. It would mean that the Church's greatest minds were wrong for centuries. Either the popes were wrong, or the new document was wrong. There was no middle ground. This was not simply a terminological disagreement, it was a challenge to the reliability of the Church's teaching authority. The Commission's response highlighted that the new Vatican Note not only dismissed the title but rendered it useless. For decades, scholars and theologians have seen Co-Redemptrix as theologically precise, meaningful, and necessary. By calling it meaningless, the document diverged sharply from the understanding of specialists. It was not a debate between conservatives and progressives or traditional versus modern approaches but a matter of preserving the fullness of how the Church speaks about Mary. The omissions in Mater Fidelis, particularly the failure to cite papal references and Vatican II's Lumen Gentium 58, were described as unusual and inexplicable, undermining the document's theological credibility. Instead of referencing the clear and deliberate teachings of multiple popes, the document relied on an extended personal interview with Fernandez himself, a choice the scholars called theologically irregular. These omissions were not trivial, they ignored centuries of evidence about Mary's co-redemptive role and mediation. Mater Fidelis also suggested that some popes used Co-Redemptrix without fully understanding it. The Commission methodically presented historical texts showing how Pius X, Pius XII, John Paul II, and others articulated the term clearly, making the dicastery's claim untenable. The issue was not minor, it was fundamental, either the popes had understood Mary's participation in redemption or they had not. The document's assertion that Mary's unique role in the redemption was not redemptive was called a contradiction, a semantic sleight of hand that no pope before or after Vatican II had ever suggested. To acknowledge her uniqueness while denying its redemptive character was to place her in a theological limbo, present but not participating, necessary but inactive. Catholic language does not allow for such reduction. The response further criticized the attempt to reduce Mary's mediation to mere intercession. Spiritual motherhood is not psychological comfort or sentimental encouragement, it is active, participatory, generative. Mary conceives, generates, births, and nourishes souls in the order of grace. Mater Fidelis's reduction of this role weakened centuries of theological clarity and risked leaving the faithful with a diminished understanding of her true participation. Even more starkly, The document omitted references to 12 popes over 4 centuries who spoke of Mary as mediatrix of all graces. The scholars described this omission as a shame, effectively a doctrinal failure, signaling a backward step in the living transmission of faith and a deviation from the historical magisterium. A major point of concern was the document's framing of Christ's merits as sufficient, subtly undermining the concept of cooperation with grace. Mary's cooperation is the model for all humanity. If she did not cooperate, then human cooperation with grace would be meaningless. Denying her redemptive role risks tilting Catholic theology toward a more Protestant understanding of salvation, where Christ acts alone and the human response is minimized. This was not a rhetorical flourish but a sober theological diagnosis. The implications of Mater Fidelis were existential for the faithful, affecting devotion, prayer, catechesis, and the perception of salvation itself. The silence that followed the Commission's response reflected the weight of centuries of teaching, the voices of popes, saints, and mystics affirming Mary as an active participant in the divine plan. The Commission also addressed the dangers of prioritizing caution over clarity. Mater Fidelis framed its argument as a preventive measure, a plea to avoid misunderstanding, but the scholars countered that fearing titles like co-redemptrix or mediatrix was to fear theological precision and centuries of careful language. No Catholic theologian has ever suggested that these titles attribute divinity or equality to Mary. The theoretical risk posed in the document was unfounded, yet it threatened to obscure the real, long-standing doctrinal testimony of the Church. By refusing to define Mary's unique role as redemptive, Mater Fidelis left her in a liminal state, close to cooperation, yet never fully operative. This was a direct contradiction of the Church's historical understanding, undermining the role of Mary as a participant in redemption. The Commission supported its argument with references from saints, popes, and theologians across centuries, illustrating that Mary's cooperation has always been central, integral, and active. The document's treatment of spiritual motherhood as merely psychological or symbolic further diluted the Church's teaching, risking a perception of Mary as inspirational rather than operative in the divine economy of grace. The Commission emphasized that these doctrinal reductions have tangible consequences. Priests, teachers, and catechists rely on precise theological language to form the faithful. Mater Fidelis's cautious approach could lead to misunderstanding Mary's role, weakening the clarity of teaching about Christ's redemption and the Church's understanding of cooperation with grace. The scholars insisted that the Church must articulate the fullness of truth rather than retreat into ambiguity. Their conclusion was unequivocal: Mary's cooperation cannot be denied, her mediation cannot be minimized, and her titles cannot be dismissed without departing from the fullness of Catholic truth. The silence that followed the release of the Commission's response reflected the gravity of the moment. The Church, the faithful, and scholars alike were confronted with a question that went beyond academic debate: will Mary continue to be recognized as she truly is, or will her role be diminished by theoretical caution? The Commission's authority, derived from decades of scholarship, insisted that denying Mary's cooperation would redefine salvation closer to Protestantism than Catholicism. This was not an attack but a clinical observation, highlighting the potential doctrinal destabilization and pastoral consequences of the document. Through meticulous examination, the Commission reconstructed the narrative of Mary's cooperation, mediation, and spiritual motherhood, demonstrating that to reduce her role is historically inaccurate, theologically negligent, and pastorally dangerous. They argued that her participation in redemption is not sentimental or symbolic but real, operative, and essential. The cumulative evidence of papal citations, mystical testimonies, and centuries of theological reflection underlined the enduring reality of Mary's redemptive work. Mater Fidelis, by contrast, attempted to reframe long-held teachings as inappropriate, creating a rupture between contemporary practice and historical tradition. Ultimately, the Commission's response affirmed that Mary's cooperation, her mediation, and her titles are central to the Church's understanding of salvation. The debate was not about personalities or bureaucratic authority but about the integrity of Catholic doctrine and devotion. The faithful are called to recognize Mary as an active, cooperating participant in the redemption of the world, fully aligned with Christ, not diminished or symbolic. The scholars invited all believers to reflect on tradition, study, and authentic teaching to appreciate the depth of Mary's role. In doing so, they ensured that the Church continues to hold Mary not merely as a figure of inspiration but as a vital agent in the unfolding of salvation, maintaining the fullness and brilliance of Catholic theology. If this message touched your heart, comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.